My first question for you, In-N-Out or Five Guys?
Oh boy, In-N-Out for sure. I've literally actually never eaten at Five Guys.
Wow.
So this is easy.
That's impressive.
Yep.
How have you avoided that?
You're welcome. I don't
In-N-Out every
eat a
time.
lot of fast food if I'm honest.
That's good.
But yeah, In-N-Out. It's just like, oh yeah, that's where
That's
you go.
the one.
Yeah.
That's kind of, I've been telling people this is kind of the how Californian are you question. Because
Yes.
it seems like, it's not 100%, but that's mostly how the lines are drawn.
Yeah.
Mostly.
Yeah. Well, my hope is that you only invite back people who like In-N-Out.
Yeah, right.
Welcome to Season 2 of 10 Questions with 10 Pastors, brought to you by Gateway Seminary. With your host, Tyler Sanders. This episode was recorded live at the SBC in Anaheim.
This is Ruben Reyes, your pastor for multiplication at Solid Rock Church in Claremont, California. And you also work for the Sin Network, and you oversee care for LA County, Orange County, and the Inland Empire, which is like 3 counties, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
2 counties?
Yeah.
It's like almost all of Southern California, except for San Diego, really.
Yes.
It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And what do you do? Can you tell us a little about your job with Sin Network?
Yeah, by all means. So my role is basically to plan for quarterly events for our church planters, and then also to plan about a dozen individual events for our church planters, hoping that our church planters form friendships. We want them to have good, healthy relationships in hopes that they'll last, in hopes that they'll really be able to actively plant healthy churches.
Yeah. Now, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you became a Christian?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I started, like the question I always struggle with is, when was Peter actually a Christian? Was it when he was called? Was it when he chopped off a fool's ear? Was it when he was called Satan by Jesus? Like, when was he actually a Christian?
Yeah.
I think God was really kind to Peter and just saying, hey, just come discover me and discover who I am and follow me.
Yeah.
I feel the same way. So I grew up in Christianity. At 16, I remember thinking like, oh, I think I'm supposed to become like Jesus. At 18, I fell in love with pastoral ministry. And honestly, I feel like I'm still discovering. So I want to say that I understood what discipleship was at 16. And I understood my role in discipleship at 16. And then I think I understood the need for pastoral ministry at 18. And I've just kind of been hustling it since then. So I think I've just kind of been a disciple of Jesus. And I probably prayed a prayer quote like thousands of times, I imagine, at all kinds of events. But since I was 16, I've actively just been trying to become like Christ.
Yeah. And what are you reading right now?
Oh, yeah. So right before my daughter was born, about 2.5, 3 years ago, I was like hustling books and I was just learning all kinds, which was wonderful. But then I read this article by Harvard that said we're the most overinformed and underprocessed generation. I read like maybe 2 books a year right now, just to be really honest. The latest book I read is a book on Christian doctrine, and I had to read it. So, and if I'm honest, I would not recommend it to anyone. So you probably don't want to ask me that. I mean, I'm always like, maybe every once in a while I have like an audio book in the background. But if I'm really honest, this season for me is more trying to process what I know. So even trying to finesse what I know. Yeah. And for that reason, I'm just not reading a whole lot right now, to be honest with you. Scripture, of course, that's fine. But
that's a good one.
Yeah.
The Bible is always good to put in the list.
Yes, it is.
Now, normally this is the section we start talking about preaching. But before we get there, because you work with church planners and you yourself are a church planner, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Solid Rock Church.
Yeah.
Can you tell us just the story of it?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I planted Solid Rock Church 8 years ago. We planted in the city of Claremont, California. Claremont, the North Claremont by LA. Yeah. It's a very left-leaning city. The average person in the city has a master's degree.
Yeah, it's a college town.
It's a college town. There's 9 colleges and universities there. At 18, I fell in love with Claremont. And at 18, I knew, I think I'm supposed to plant a church in this city eventually.
So those things are connected. Your understanding of pastoral ministry in the city. And wow, okay.
Yeah, very. And I just fell in love with the people. I mean, they're my people, you know? I mean, they're kind of quirky. They're, like I said, they're left-leaning. They care about things that not everybody cares about. But I grew up there, and so I felt like I knew them. And And also there's just not a lot of Christians. And so I had this burden too to share the gospel with the city. And my wife did too. We weren't married at the time, of course, but she had a similar burden. So 3 or 4 weeks before I turned 23, I planted a local church in a bookstore, which was crazy. Yeah. And looking back on it, I don't know if I do it again, but I did it. And it was really, really hard and really, really challenging. In some ways, it was great, though, because the only thing I had going for me was Jesus as the senior pastor and God's Spirit being with us.
Right.
We didn't have money. We didn't have a building. We didn't have any roles, or we didn't have any. I mean, it was hard. It was really hard. But man, God's Spirit was with us. So we planted. About 3 years in, I kind of hit a wall. I was doing everything myself. A good friend of mine said, "Hey, you need to start developing leaders. If you don't, you're going to burn out." We spent the next year developing leaders. And for the last 4 years now, Solid Rock Church has planted 2 more churches. We have a 3rd on the way.
Wow.
Even a 4th on the way, hopefully. We've started a pastoral residency. Baptized over 100 people, including Claremont College students. And actually one of the churches we've started meets on Saturday nights at the Claremont Colleges, which you never would have dreamed that would have happened.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I remember planting and people saying like, nah, don't do that. You don't do that. That's where churches go to die. Or there's no way, they're too liberal and you could never do that. And you know, in some ways they were right. I genuinely couldn't, but I do think that God's Spirit did it. And I do think that our senior pastor did it. And it's been incredible to watch.
Yeah.
Coming out of COVID, we kind of had this season where we thought, okay, what's next? And we came to the conclusion that what wasn't next was me. And so I just, my wife and I made a commitment to pastor Solid Rock for 7 years. And as we kind of rethought about what does the future look like, we just realized, no, we don't think that's it. And at least being the pastor for preaching and vision. And so coming out of COVID, we knew it would be another 3 to 5 year commitment just to rebuild Solid Rock Church. Yeah. And we felt like, no, we're not supposed to do that. So one of our staff members, Hunter Bingham, he actually jumped in and became the new pastor for preaching and vision. Yeah. And I became the pastor for multiplication. Yeah. Just because I love church planting.
And so tell me about that role now. Like, what are some of your responsibilities in that role?
Yeah, I mean, so my chief role is to oversee our pastoral residency. We have anywhere from 2 to 5 guys in our pastoral residency every year.
Wow.
The main hope of that is to develop pastor elders in the local church. Yeah. A sort of secondary hope of that is that we can hopefully develop church planters out of that pastoral residency. And really, not everybody that comes out of that identifies as a pastor. Not everybody that comes out of that has a calling to be a local pastor, and not everybody that comes out of that has a calling to be a local church planter. Yeah. But what they do have is a competency around biblical eldership, and we love that. Right. And honestly, we'd want that for all of our members.
Yeah,
so
of course. Yeah.
That's my main role. Apart from that, I also help Solid Rock administratively, and then I also help Solid Rock basically with leadership development. So everything from, hey, I'm a new Christian, all the way down to I'm ready to plant a church. Yeah. That's kind of my role within that leadership view.
Well, let me ask you some questions about preaching now.
Yeah, sure.
So when you were preaching kind of week to week, and maybe this is even part of how you're helping train future pastors, big picture, how do you approach like a series or themes or whatever? Like, how far out in the future are you looking? What's your approach?
Yeah, it was always a year. So I'm a Enneagram 8. I'm really planned, really organized, really detailed. It was always planned, and it was mostly book by book. And there was a couple reasons for that. It was never though not changeable. So if something came up, we wouldn't have a problem responding to it. Or if even we felt like there were weeks where I'd feel like, man, I think God wants me to talk about this. I didn't mind saying, we're not going to go through that part of the book. We're just going to teach on this. It was okay to just do book by book, but be really flexible. There was also chances and times though that, we'd focus on series, on different studies, be it a study about sexuality or even be it a study about, at times like idolatry or even sometimes a study about parenting. We didn't mind doing those things at all. But for the most part, we mostly went. I grew up in Calvary Chapel. My grandparents were saved in the Jesus People movement. My parents kind of were in the Jesus People. I grew up just like verse by verse, book by book. That's just kind of what you did. And I liked it, to be fair. I mean, I like that type of exegetical teaching. And I really enjoyed it. But that's kind of what our rhythm was.
Yeah.
Always trying to shoot for 1 year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, week to week, what was your process like? Like of actually developing a specific sermon?
Sure. I mean, so the structure of my sermons are, I have a thesis. It's kind of like a paper, right? So I have a thesis. My thesis has to stand up to the filter of the text, of the context, and of the gospel. So if my thesis doesn't make sense in those 3 filters, then I'm like, no, we need to rework that a little bit. And the reason is because we really want people to see Jesus more than anything, right? So the end of my teaching, hopefully, is people seeing Jesus. My philosophy of preaching is information, formation, and adoration. So my philosophy of teaching, I really hope, I want to give you information. Like, we have a text here, right? We want that. But I want you to be formed by this information too. So I don't really just want you to hear this info and feel like, oh yeah, great, now you have a big head and you can go out in the world. I want you to be formed by it. Like, hey, what's Jesus saying to me?
Yeah.
A question we always ask is, what does this mean for disciples and non-disciples? So what's the implication
That's a good question.
here? Yeah. And then I wanted to lead to adoration. So at Solid Rock, all of our worship as music is at the end of our gathering, hoping that after you've heard the gospel, you can respond in singing and worship. Right?
I've always loved that.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
We never do that. It's so rare to see that in churches, but that always has kind of made more sense to me.
Well, I mean, here we are heralding the gospel. It's like, great, you can respond with half of a song and then go.
Yeah.
And could you leave quickly because our other service has to come in? So I just, that doesn't really work for me. I'm like, no, I want to sit here for a minute and try to, I want to be formed and I want to respond to what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So because of that, the structure of my teaching at the end is always, okay, hey, now how can I call you back to worship? Like, maybe this week was hard for you. Maybe this Thursday was difficult. How do I call you back, though, to a life of worship and remind you of your identity? We would say all the time that Christians' first primary identity should be as a local disciple missionary. And that's all hyphenated for us. It's one word for us. It's like, that is your role. You should be a local disciple missionary. And I think my teaching kind of, it's to hopefully gird that view that we have of discipleship and of a philosophy of teaching.
Yeah. What is the most difficult passage or topic you've preached on?
Yeah, for sure, sexuality. I mean, we've got a lot of college students in our church, and we've always had a lot of college students in our church. It's just something we have to talk about.
Yeah.
I've taught through. Right before COVID hit, I wrote an 8-part study on, we called it God and Sex, so on sexuality, sexual ethics, sexual preference, everything in between. And it got cut short because of COVID, which I was really sad about. But we've taught on that. We've taught that study twice now. And I think for us, it's that those topics are more often than not what people want to talk about. And I think sometimes we keep giving people the foot, like, hey, go live on mission, go live on mission, go live on mission. And I think that's good. Hear me say that. I mean, at the end of our every gathering we have a benediction where we send you as a local disciple missionary. So we're for that. But there's also questions that people have, and sexuality is a huge one in Claremont. It's a huge one in Los Angeles. It's just a part of our town is remarkably hyper modern and post-Christian or pre-Christian, whatever you want to say. But that matters to them.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of their angst is, why can't we just talk about this? And so we've been able to make a lot of really good connections in just talking about this. And we always try to make ourselves available afterwards. Say, hey, we want to talk to you. We got people who said that was too liberal. We got people who say that was too conservative. We got people who say you're sex shaming me, or we always have something, right?
Yeah.
But the hope is, hey, we're willing to talk about this, and we're at least, most of the people who would give us criticism would say, I'm glad you're talking about it, and say, okay, well, let's just be happy we're talking about it here, right? Yeah. But it is. I mean, it's such a big part of our culture.
Yeah.
It's really challenging. People always feel ostracized and hurt.
Well, it's so deeply entwined in many people's identities now.
Yeah.
So it's a topic that can strike right to the core of a person.
Yes.
How they understand themselves. At least.
Absolutely. That's well said.
What's a role or responsibility you have in ministry do you think is like a sweet spot, and maybe one that's kind of a growing edge or something you're kind of working on?
Okay. Yeah. I think so. Something that I only do it with a few people, but it's a gift, I think, is candor. There's a leadership book that just came out by Paul Tripp, and he actually mentions it in that book. Which that's a book I read. There you go.
Yeah.
No.
Let's edit that back in earlier.
Right, right. I do read, but I promise I'm not dumb. That's an interesting one to me because I don't think we use it enough. I was surprised it was in his book. I've read I've actually never read a book with that word in there, that information.
Yeah.
But my ability, I think, to speak real directly to leaders, real directly to some of our pastors and just be like, hey, I love you, but, or I love you or I love you, what did you think about this? Or I love you and what are you thinking through? What are you processing? That candor, I think, is really strong. And it's what creates a really healthy environment to say, I don't want to shame you. I don't want to push you away. I actually just want to ask you genuinely, what is this? And everybody else knows it. They're just ignoring it. But I'm willing to kind of say it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
I was the other part of that, like, what's something maybe you want to grow in or something that's a little more difficult for you? So I am an Enneagram 8, and sometimes I have to be real careful about how I say things. I have to be real careful about my punchiness. And that's why I've learned, hey, my candor is good, but only with some people.
It's kind of the same thing in a way.
Yeah.
Or it's related maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the sushi's knife, right? The sushi chef's knife, and it's man, you do this wrong, you could really mess up this piece of fish. You do this right, though, it's gonna be the best thing you ate tonight. So I think that's how I feel sometimes. Like, oh man, this is so delicate, and I want to, and I love you, and I don't want you to think I don't love you, but I also have to say. So it's something that I'll probably work on for the rest of my life, to be honest, is to have words that are kind and that sound sweet and that are filled with grace. But true.
Yeah. Can you give me a swing and a miss you've made in ministry? You're a church planner, so I know there's lots of swings.
Sure. I mean, we've done a lot of things that I thought were good, but didn't. Our community was like, what was that? Some things that actually were good. I mean, speaking of the greatest hamburger on planet Earth, like one time we brought In-N-Out to the Claremont colleges, and we basically like, hey, we just want to invite you to our church, and we're giving away free In-N-Out, 500 burgers. I mean, we had a line for days, and after the event, students came out, and we asked for people's email address. And students came out, they're like, how could you ask us for our email address? Like, that's our most prized possession. and it was such a, and at once I was like, oh, okay, this is a bit much. But then I tried to be humble and I tried to be teachable. I was like, oh yeah, that sounds hard. And it was such a, I thought this would have worked anywhere else, except for the Claremont colleges. Like, somehow we're bad for giving you free burgers. Okay, but that said, we tried to learn from it. We tried to be real patient. And it was a miss, sadly. It was, and we never even did anything with those email addresses because we just felt like if we do, we're only gonna pour gas on that bad fire.
The whole
So that was a miss. Very expensive, hamburger-ridden miss.
Now, this is my last question for you. If you could go back to, how old were you when you planted the church? 23?
Yeah, 22, 23.
22, 23. If you could go back today and tell 22, 23-year-old Ruben something, what advice would you give him?
Yeah. I mean, so I want to say I'd probably tell Ruben, hey, listen more. Listen more, speak less, lean into healthier relationships. I think part of the reason that I do what I do with the Send Network is because I think a lot of our planters are really lonely. And I think sometimes they're lonely because they almost believe that their role is to have all the answers. And they don't always listen well. Like, as church planners, by default, we're just not the best listeners. We're really good communicators. And if you think about it, we're even trained to talk more than we listen. Yeah. Right? Both in secular and in Christian education. That's literally what we're trained in and through. I wish I listened more. And I wish I listened to people that I thought I didn't need to listen to. So the other part of this is, like, there's this weird hierarchy of who I believed I should listen to versus who I wouldn't listen to. And it was oftentimes, it had nothing to do with God's Spirit and everything to do with what I thought were qualifications that really didn't mean as much, I think, to God's church. So I wish I would have listened more. I wish I would have asked more questions. I don't know people. I mean, Yeah. I feel like rarely does somebody, but before death, it's not like, man, I wish I would have talked more.
Yeah.
I wish I would have been more present with my family and listened more.
Yeah.
And I feel that. I want that for my daughter. I want that for my son. I want that for our leaders in our church. I remember, just a quick little side story, but I remember before I planted the church I came out of, we were in a gathering, and a guy came out and he gave me a book, and I don't know who this guy was. I never got his name and I never saw him again, but he gave me this book. He was a real person, but he gave me this book, and in it he wrote all of the scripture about listening. Oh. And I actually I never put that together. I kind of read it and I was like, oh, that's weird. Crazy guy left. Like that was a win. But I kept it. Right. Just recently, as I moved out of my library office, I went through it and I thought, oh, wow, I completely missed that. I completely missed that. I wish I would have listened a bit more.
Yeah. That was my last question. I could ask you more, I'm sure, but
I feel like we could talk all day.
I know. Yeah, this is great.
Which we will, just not record it.
Yeah,
hopefully.
we just won't record it. We will make all the podcast listeners listen in on that. Well, thank you so much, Ruben. I really appreciate you spending time with us today.
My joy. Thanks for having me.